Sound good?
Good, thank you. Welcome everybody to this webinar on road pricing and traffic reduction. My name is Stephen Joseph. I'm a trustee and chair of the Foundation for Integrated Transport, and this webinar is to in fact showcase some of the work that we've been funding, and you'll hear presentations about two projects that we funded on road pricing and traffic reduction. And then you'll hear comments from others about what they've heard. The context for this, I think, is that in the context of discussing the decarbonisation of transport, transport is the main source of greenhouse gases emissions in the UK, and there is a consensus that just moving to electric vehicles won't meet the net zero target and the carbon budgets from 2030 onwards, and that there will need to be reductions in vehicle mileage. The Foundation is one of the few grant-making trusts that's focused on this and focused on funding work on this. We were set up as a foundation by Dr. Simon Norton. In fact, it's nearly the 4th anniversary of his death, which was sad for us and for everybody in the transport campaigning world. And the Foundation is carrying on his memory, in his memory, and funding projects on integrated transport. Our theme for the last year has been about traffic reduction with an emphasis on road pricing. And what you'll hear now is from first Sylvia Barrett from the Campaign for Better Transport, and then from Elspeth Ray from Transform Scotland about the work they've been doing in this area. So without more ado, I'd like to introduce Sylvia Barrett, who's the Director of Policy at the Campaign for Better Transport. I should say the campaign celebrated its 50th anniversary yesterday. I ran the organisation for some time and was pleased to be around to celebrate the 50th anniversary last week, and it's still carrying on doing great work on reducing the impact of transport on the environment and promoting public transport. So Sylvia, let's hear from you on road pricing. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Stephen. While I set up my screen share, I'll just say a little bit about Campaign for Better Transport for those of you who might not know us very well. We're a national charity for sustainable transport, and this includes anything from active travel, walking, cycling, public transport, shared mobility, and vehicle electrification. We are also the only charity in the sector that covers all these modes, and we promote integration between those modes. So very pleased to be working with Foundation for Integrated Transport on this project. Now, can anyone give me a note if the slides are fine? Great, thank you so much. So, sorry, I need to start from the beginning. The purpose of doing this research was about finding out what the general public think about road pricing. So the context for this was the shift to electric vehicles, which is necessary to, of course, meet net zero. But in addition to that, we need traffic reduction, as Stephen mentioned. And the downside of the move to electric vehicles is the loss of revenue from vehicle taxation. Obviously, they don't pay fuel duty, and they are currently not paying VED because although that is changing from 2025. So the big thing that's changing in the politicians' eyes is the need to replenish that revenue. The Treasury has already acknowledged that it intends to keep revenue from motor taxation broadly the same. but they have not said how exactly they will do that. So distance-based road pricing, which is what we're talking about here as a way to replace fuel duty in VD long-term, is the obvious choice of how this might happen. There are, of course, other reasons that reform of vehicle taxation is needed. There's a lack of transparency and lack of fairness in the current system. Traffic reduction, as we already mentioned, as a way to not only meet net zero, but also to improve air quality, road safety, and other goods. We need to also rebalance the pricing signals away from driving and in favor of public transport to promote that modal shift, which is required going forward. Of course, politicians have long seen road pricing as something that's politically toxic, and that's because of past discussions about it. However, it's been a while since the public view on this was tested to any great depth. So our research aimed to plug that gap. It's the most extensive research on road pricing as in recent years. We conducted a number of focus groups, a very in-depth long survey of over 3,000 people. We did expert roundtables and interviews. So what did our research show? The research took people on a journey. First of all, we looked at people's views on the need for vehicle taxation reform. Then we looked at various ways of framing the need for that reform and the benefits and disbenefits of replacing fuel duty and VD with pay-as-you-drive. And then how we can basically address various concerns that people had about this. So the first of those questions was, do people agree that there's need to reform? So there was two broad framings for this. One was that income from fuel duty and car tax is falling as people switching to electric vehicles, which is basically the rationale in the government's eyes. And the other framing is that the current system is confusing, not very transparent, and people can't easily keep on top of how much they're paying. So both of these framings elicited basically similar responses that the vast majority, 3 out of 5 people, agree that there is a need for vehicle taxation reform. So then we introduced the concept of pay-as-you-drive, as we called it, that it's basically replacing fuel duty and VD with a distance-based charge. And we asked people at various stages of the survey whether they support the concept of pay-as-you-drive or not. So this chart shows you the people's views at the start and at the end of the survey. We can see that people's views changed, and more people supported pay-as-you-drive at the end of the survey than at the start. So that's a majority of people, so nearly half of people supported pay-as-you-drive, as opposed to 18% that don't. So basically this demonstrates that when the concept is explained to people and we talk about different ways to address concern, support increases. We then tested various ways of sort of what arguments for replacing the current system people find convincing or less convincing. So that basically was to find out how the need to reform can be best explained to people. So we found 2 of the main arguments most compelling. So the first one was that taxation from vehicle revenue from vehicle tax is due to diminish because of the transition to EVs, and the need to replace this if we are to continue funding public services out of general taxation, which is what that tax goes to. So there was broad agreement that electric vehicle drivers should pay tax like all other drivers. So there was an inherent fairness argument behind that. And also 56% of people agreed that there's this need to be fiscally responsible to continue funding public services. Although it's something that some people might think it's counterintuitive, that people would agree that taxation needs to continue, people recognize the need to be responsible with public finances, and that's illustrated by this quote here. But when we, people would then think, well, some people would consider if electric vehicles are the problem and that is resulting in a gap in taxation. Shouldn't we just tax electric vehicles and leave the rest of the system alone? And there is some agreement to that, again, approximately half of people. But then on the other hand, a greater proportion of people believe that if we are to change taxation, it will only be fair if it applies to all drivers. So there's this preference for a single system as opposed to different confusing ways of dealing with vehicle tax. And I think the last sort of couple of bars on this chart show you the sort of end consensus on this, that it's fair that electric vehicles should be charged, but at a lower rate than petrol and diesel vehicles. So there's a preference for a single system with different rates for different vehicles depending on their emissions. The second concept that people are also attracted to is the ability to be able to pay less if you drive less. Again, some people would say that this is the current way that fuel duty works. It's paid on liter of fuel that you use. But the problem when we tested this in focus groups was that people don't see the taxation linked to the cost of fuel at the pumps. It's all basically part of the cost that you pay at the pumps. So many people think that the current system is not transparent and pay as you drive would be more transparent. And that would enable people to budget better. They would be able to make that link between how much they drive and how much they pay much clearer. And therefore driving that behavior change, enabling people to see a change when they combine trips, when they replace unnecessary journeys with other modes and so on. So that again explains about how a pay-as-you-drive can promote behavior change. We tested the views on people about that need to that need to reduce the impacts of driving on people's health and on the environment versus people's preference that we need to be free to drive as much as we want, regardless of those negative impacts. So this shows you that about 30% of people still feel inclined that they want to have that freedom, but a bigger proportion, so more than half of people feel that, yes, it is right to reduce the impacts of driving, even if it means that some people need to cut down on driving. So we need to be mindful of the first group, but also bearing in mind that a majority of people understand the need to reduce traffic for the benefit of everyone. And there was also this view that a national scheme has a greater overall support than local congestion and pollution charging schemes. So we tested support for a national scheme, but also these local schemes as an alternative or as complementary to a national scheme. And a national scheme elicited greater levels of support because basically it replaces a current system of charging with something else rather than adding on top of what people already pay. So where does that leave us in terms of scheme design? We saw broadly three ways forward or three options for implementation. One was an EV-only system, at least at the start. The benefit of that is that it's very simple, it's quicker to implement, easier to understand, and it doesn't require vehicle tracking. But the downside is that it doesn't tackle the issues that we have in the current system for fuel duty and VED. It creates two different systems and it penalizes people that don't have alternatives. It can slow down the uptake of electric vehicles. The next option is possibly something that we can transition from if EV-only system is used as a test bed, as a pilot. Then you can move to replacing fuel duty in VED for all vehicles with a per mile charge. Now that would be a static charge based on mileage only, but the rate that each driver pays would vary depending on the emissions of the car. Again, it wouldn't need tracking, but it would be more sort of intelligent about the comparative emissions. The downside of this is that it still penalizes people. It doesn't reflect where and when people are driving. And when we first asked people about whether they support pay-as-you-drive, the number one factor, a reason for which people did not support it is because it wouldn't be fair on people that don't have the alternatives to driving. So our argument was that the only sort of fairest way to implement pay-as-you-drive would be a smart per-mile charge that varies by obviously emissions, but also by location and possibly time of day. And this is because it most accurately reflects the impact of different journeys. So you would be charging less for driving in, say, rural areas or at off-peak times, and more for driving in areas that do have that alternative to driving, so good public transport links and at the specific times of day. So obviously that accounts for that availability of alternatives. The downside is that it's slightly more complicated, and obviously it requires vehicle tracking to implement. In many people's eyes, that is a big barrier to implementation. But when we tested the different technology options for how a system can be implemented, we saw that there's very little difference between levels of support for the mileage-only option, which is the one on the far left, so with regular odometer checks, and the two options in the middle. So inbuilt telematics or plug-in device with encryption to track the vehicle. Relatively similar levels of people supported both of these options. The one technology that people opposed was roadside cameras, which we were surprised about because we thought that obviously cameras are a well-established way of reporting and sort of charging vehicles, but people associated them with basically penalty charges and tracking speed limits and so on. But the in-vehicle option was not one that people objected to. But we thought that when we tested mitigations about that, people thought that being able to opt out of that charge, of the tracking, and pay a set charge instead, or move to the middle option of just being charged by mileage, obviously at a slightly higher rate, that's an option for people that inherently object to the tracking on the basis of privacy concerns and so on. We also asked about mitigations, so ways to address any negative impacts on people that are disproportionately affected to this. So the likes of people on low incomes, or people that don't have availability of alternatives, disabled people, for example, that do need to use a car. There's various options to mitigate. So for example, there's complete exemptions, there are lower rates per mile, or you can have a tax-free mileage allowance. So people getting a certain number of miles that they can drive for free, and after that they're charged. That does address the concerns of people that are unfairly charged. But the number one mitigation, so when we asked about ways to make the system fairer, is to invest in public transport. So 69% supported this at a much higher rate of any of the other mitigations. And the big benefit of a smart charge is that it can give policymakers the option to target those cuts and mitigations at specific groups, something that's not possible with fuel duty at the moment. There was a concern among some people that using complete exemptions would be a way for people to cheat the system, whereas obviously another half of people thought that exemptions are necessary. So we need to be careful about what sort of mitigations we offer to different groups. And we argue that lower rates are sort of a better mitigation than complete exemptions, because exemptions are harder to sort of roll back later on if needed. We did ask about how the money should be raised, how it should be spent. There was a big preference for local implementation and local investment with the revenue. I'm going to skip through those because I have a feeling I'm running out of time. And in terms of mitigations, we can talk about the differences between national and local scheme. I'm sure it will come up later in the discussion. But what we said is that a national scheme could progress between the three options, or you could start with, you can use the EV only as a pilot and then move to a smart system with the option to opt out and just use the second version for that. But priority when it comes to reform needs to be given to communicating this, the need for reform because of the electric vehicle transition and the need to replenish taxation. Focus on the drive less and pay less as a way of people to tackle the cost of living, ring fencing a proportion to investment in public transport, and obviously being fair and having a higher allowance or lower rates for people that live in rural areas. We think that the government needs to depoliticize this and establish a commission to achieve that cross-party agreement on the need to reform, and then report after the next general election about the options for implementation and consult on the way forward. So thank you for listening, and I'm sure I'll look forward to the discussion afterwards.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. There are already lots of questions coming in, and I'm making a note of those from the YouTube discussion. I'd now like to introduce Elspeth Ray, who's Head of Enterprise at Transform Scotland, and which is an equivalent to the Campaign for Better Transport in Scotland, promotes sustainable transport there. And she's going to talk about the work that Transform have been doing on traffic reduction. Thank you.
Okay, hello everybody. Can you hear and see me okay? Yeah. I'll just share my screen. Okay, so can everybody see that? Yeah, okay, thank you very much for having me here today. As Stephen mentioned, my name is Elspeth. I work for Transform Scotland, where I am the Head of Enterprise. And we were funded to do this work on targeting traffic, winning business support for traffic reduction. We were funded through the Foundation for Integrated Transport over the past 12 months. For those of you who haven't come across us before, just a little bit about it. We are the National Alliance for Sustainable Transport. We celebrated our 25th anniversary last year, and we are the collective voice for sustainable transport. We're a membership organisation. Our members vary from major transport companies all the way down to local passenger campaign groups, universities, local authorities, environmental NGOs, all sorts of people. And we campaign for walking, cycling and public transport. So this project, the aims of our targeting traffic project, fundamentally the aim was to bring Scotland's business community into the conversation about traffic reduction and demand management, focusing specifically on road use pricing, congestion charging, workplace parking levy, low emission zones. And what we wanted to do through this project is show that there are policies available which can cut congestion and support economic growth. We wanted to show that business leaders can be supportive of change, and by doing so to give the Scottish Government political breathing space to talk about these policies. This photograph here, this is an event that we held towards the end of our project. We had a targeting our traffic summit, and that's the Transport Minister, Jenny Gilruth, MSP, who spoke at that event, and we also had leaders from across Scotland's business community. So we brought people together to have that conversation. A little bit of background. We do have a target for traffic reduction in Scotland. I saw some of the chat questioning if there was political will to do this, and I think in Scotland the answer is yes. The Scottish Government understands that electric vehicles are not enough to meet our climate change targets, and so we have a target to cut car kilometres by 20% by 2030. We have a routes map which sets out the actions to achieving that, one of which is recognition of the need for measures which will discourage car use, to use the government's words. However, these sorts of ideas haven't gone down well in the past. The business community has traditionally been seen as an opponent to things like road pricing and congestion charging. And that's meant that sometimes politicians are a bit nervous about talking about these kinds of issues because they might fear it will make them unpopular. So we wanted to challenge that and show that actually businesses are maybe more progressive than we give them credit for. And also to open up the conversation. So we're not just talking to other NGOs, people in the sustainable traffic community. We wanted to get the conversation out there to people that might hold other opinions, other priorities, that disagree with us, to understand what they thought. So the first part of this is we commissioned research from Edinburgh Nuclear University, and we asked them to look for evidence of how Scottish businesses and economy might be affected by traffic demand management measures. They did that by looking at evidence of how these types of measures have been applied in other parts of the UK and internationally, and they sifted through all of the academic literature and other sources they could find. And then we used this research findings as a basis for our discussion with business community in Scotland. So I'm quickly going to go through what the university finds out. So they looked at 4 measures primarily. The first of these is low emission zones. So not strictly speaking a traffic reduction measure, but it is in the Scottish Government's 20% traffic reduction look back. So we asked them to look at that. And what they found out from the view of the evidence was that the potential for LEZs to cut traffic is unknown, which the business community was kind of quite surprised and maybe pleased to hear, because they're potentially concerned that LEZs might discourage economic activity in city centres, for example. They found that the main impact of LEZs on the road haulage sector. Most private vehicles are unaffected, so people commuting to work, and they didn't find any evidence for negative economic impacts. Secondly, we asked the academics to look at workplace parking levies. So by sifting through the literature, they found that there didn't appear to be any significant impact on competitiveness or economic activity due to workplace parking levies. That's in high-value economic locations where workplace parking levies have typically been applied to date. They find that sometimes small businesses can be exempted, and that they're most successful when they're part of a package, so when the income from workplace parking levy is used to fund public transport improvements, but that it can be difficult to determine how much they actually cut traffic, because there might be lots of things going on at the same time. Thirdly, Napier University looked at congestion charging. So yes, it does cut traffic. Where it's been applied elsewhere, they saw that it can be supported by businesses. Some of the benefits might be quicker delivery times, less congestion, less delay, better use of space, increase in public transport patronage. They did specifically look for how congestion charging might affect retail, and they found that it's difficult to quantify that effect specifically. And then finally, national road user charging. So by looking at how sort of other sort of similar schemes have worked in other countries, they found that reductions are possible of up to 10%. Business benefits could be more efficient use of the fleet, greater uptake of local shopping by encouraging people to travel more locally, and potentially a more economically efficient use of the road network, depending upon what sort of system is used, as I think Sylvia went over some of the options in her presentation. We then asked, so how could this apply to Scotland? How could these measures affect the Scottish business community? So unsurprisingly, probably going to work better in urban areas. Outside, especially in Scotland, we've got the Highlands with islands, people travelling very long distances, so out of the major towns and cities, less appropriate. Aberdeen, Edinburgh and Glasgow, especially Edinburgh, the most suitable locations where these types of schemes could be implemented. And also, yeah, looking at the central belt and trunk roads where most of the traffic is, and where the public transport alternatives are better. So those are the locations where these types of schemes might work. So business benefits to highlight. So again, as I mentioned, potential to have a more economically efficient road use system, shorter journeys, better use of space, more accessibility to the labour market. So those were some of the benefits which the research pulled out that have helped businesses elsewhere when those measures have been applied. Also, just briefly, implementation costs, looking at, for example, that the cost of national road user charging, which is something the business community is interested in, looking at the cost of congestion charging and workplace parking levy and how cost effective these measures might be. So what we did is we took those findings to the business community. We consulted all of the major business groups in Scotland, particularly, for example, Federation of Small Businesses, Scottish Council of Development and Industry, and we shared the findings with them and discussed what recommendations they would make, or if we could work together on policy solutions for traffic reduction and road traffic demand management in Scotland. So I'm going to briefly go over the 4 key themes that emerged from those conversations with business groups. So the first theme to emerge was talk to us, and this is a picture of some happy business leaders chatting about road pricing at our traffic summit, which we held in October. And what we found through this project was that business leaders want to be part of the conversation, so they want to be involved, and they really welcome the opportunity to have these conversations. There was potential to work with the government, the Scottish Government, perhaps on a trial project, workplace parking levy, for example. Maybe we could do a pilot on an industrial estate or the business park. I think there was a feeling among the business community that we need to communicate more clearly why electric vehicles are not the only answer. So there might still be the perception that EVs are going to cut carbon and solve our problems. So why do we need to cut traffic? I don't know if that message has got out there. The need to demonstrate the benefits to the business community, which I've just gone through, so show them how they could benefit from these measures, whilst recognising that it is a really challenging time to do business. So the types of issues that were brought up a lot were the cost of living crisis, the change in travel patterns post-COVID, so the change in use of travel town centres. Also, challenges with recruitment was mentioned. So, for example, some businesses were concerned that if you had, say, a congestion charge or the workplace parking levy, it might deter people from working for that business. And in a competitive labour market, that is a concern about attracting staff. And also the perception that mobility is seen as an enabler of economic growth. So mobility is good. And if you're talking about traffic reduction, then that can be a challenge. Second key theme to emerge was investment in public transport. And again, I think this was something that Sylvia touched upon too. So it seems like similar messages are coming out from both of our pieces of work. So again and again, business leaders told us that public transport needs to be a viable alternative to the car, but there is an opportunity to reinvest the income from car traffic demand management measures back into public transport and active travel. Whilst recognising the challenges to some people and places, so particular issues which were raised were, for example, people who work on like light industrial units at the edge of town where there's poor public transport, shift workers who might have to commute at unsociable hours, tradespeople who might use their van to transport their tools and equipment. So for some people, it's going to be harder than others. And then there was a lot of interest in reinvesting income from these types of measures in local economies, local neighbourhoods, in the idea of 20-minute neighbourhoods, which has a lot of traction in Scotland at the moment, and also giving businesses credit for helping to fund those types of improvements, which helps them to look greener. Thirdly, this is the third key message that came over, was businesses really wanted to know what is it going to mean for my business, and there were a lot of unanswered questions. I think that the research that we commissioned from the Edinburgh and Napier University was really helpful in answering some of these questions and showing what sort of evidence does exist of how these measures have applied in practice elsewhere. So the type of issues which came up, businesses were really wanting to know what's going to be the impact on customer footfall, on town centres, behaviour. They wanted to know who's going to end up paying. So is it going to be the business owner? Is it going to be customers, employees, suppliers? They wanted to know how it's going to affect different types of business. So, obviously the business community is really diverse. So the Federation of Small Businesses, for example, was concerned with impacts on maybe people who are home-based, maybe just a one-person business, working very locally, businesses on the local high street who want more local traffic, and then you've got up to like retail parks, out-of-town shopping centres, for example. There was concern about how this could affect workers on lower incomes, also rural areas outside our towns and cities. And again, there was a feeling that post-COVID, there's a lot of economic uncertainty, which might make it harder to sort of model what impact these types of measures are going to have. So fourth key topic that we discussed with businesses is what kind of scheme would work best for Scotland. So there's a general consensus that most of these measures are going to work better in urban areas, so I guess not surprisingly. But city centre congestion charging in particular came across as quite unpopular. One of the business groups suggested that perhaps car-free city centres would be a better or the fairer alternative. In general, I think there's more support for a single national road pricing type scheme, potentially with variable pricing according to local circumstances. And that's, I guess, broadly seen as being fairer and less divisive than having different types of schemes working in different areas. And I would also say on that, the taxation arguments I think, are well understood. So the idea that fuel duty is going to run out, the government needs more tax income, I think those arguments are really picked up by businesses. And then the final point here was just about the so vehicle excise duty and fuel duty are reserved for Westminster. So there is a question about what can we implement in Scotland, what has to happen at a UK level, and how does that work together, and what's that relationship like? So that's another question that businesses came to us with. So finally, what next? We did this work last year. We concluded in October, November. And as I say, we concluded with that Tackling Traffic Summit, where we brought together politicians and business leaders. The Scottish Government is going to soon publish its own research, which it's commissioned, looking into the impacts of traffic demand management measures in Scotland. They plan to publish a car demand management framework by 2025. Transform Scotland as an organisation, we'd like to get more urgency to that and to push the government to do that sooner rather than later. There's also a lot of work in Scotland which overlaps on this, looking at the cost of public transport and pricing. So we have something called the Fair Fares Review in Scotland, which is looking at these cost issues. And for Transform Scotland, we want to keep building support for traffic reduction, demand management, and making the case for change. And that's me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Elspeth. That was a really interesting run through of what you've been doing and the situation in Scotland. We now have time for a couple of responses to that. First from Sue Flack, who has been there, seen it, done it, and got the T-shirt, as it were, in terms of implementing the workplace parking levy in Nottingham, so far the only workplace parking levy scheme in the country, and has since acted as a consultant to other places and authorities interested in following this. So, Sue, do you have reflections on what you've heard from Sylvia and Elspeth?
Yes, thank you.
Your experience.
Thank you, Stephen. Yes, indeed, yes. First of all, I'd like to say that I'd like to thank the Foundation for Integrated Transport for funding this work, and for the two organisations, Campaign for Better Transport and Transform Scotland, for doing it, because I genuinely think it's really valuable work that is absolutely urgent and absolutely needs to be done, and provides us with quite a lot of insights into how to get a charging scheme up and running. So thanks to everyone concerned. For me, I've had the dubious honour of working both for Nottingham, which managed to get a workplace parking levy going, and also for Leicester, which recently decided not to progress with workplace parking levy. And there are a couple of aspects to that I'd just like to mention. First of all, when a charging scheme is being considered, the vision for what the money is going to be spent on, even if the justification for doing a charging scheme is to reduce car use or to reduce pollution or whatever, the vision for the improvements that connect to it are vitally important. And I think it's fairly clear that councils are not often that good at actually presenting a good vision. Nottingham perhaps managed to do it because it focused on a tram and new tram services, and that was something that perhaps was easier for people to understand, whereas Leicester focused on a integrated transport improvements, including a bus transformation and active travel, and that was difficult to get across what the benefits would be for individual people. So that vision is really important. And I think one of the reasons, there are lots of reasons why Nottingham managed to get charging going, but I think perhaps in summary, it was that they managed to make it seem that charging was a necessity, that there wasn't really an argument that it had to happen, and therefore people sort of were more likely to go along with it. And just another couple of things. Sylvia didn't cover this in her survey, but in my experience, people see charging as a tax and not as a price. So whilst economists might see it purely as a price on driving, people see it as a tax. And because they see it as a tax, in order to be acceptable, I think it has to be progressive. It has to have some element of progressiveness in it, or people won't accept it. And that was a really big issue in Leicester. So people who are on lower incomes, or as we've talked about, as the speakers already talked about, people who live in rural areas, don't have alternatives, there must be recognition of those issues in any charging scheme, I think. You should note as well that at the moment, with the cost of living crisis, politicians are extremely sensitive to charging for anything at all, not only road charging, but anything. And it's really difficult on a local level for politicians to make the argument about charging in the current climate. On the upside, I don't know if Elspeth would agree or not, but I think that over time, business has got more amenable to charging for car use and is not the biggest obstacle in putting in a new scheme. Elspeth looks like she might argue with that. And then finally, I just wanted to mention that I think the recent initiatives like low traffic neighborhoods actually give us something to think about, because for a charging scheme, a standard consultative process is absolutely no good whatsoever. It needs to be long-term. It needs to be very much specific engagement of specific types of people on how they're going to benefit or on how they're going to pay. And it needs to be consistent. So, it needs to be a really consistent long-term approach. It's not a standard approach at all. And I think councils have got some way to go in understanding that, if it's to be done at local level. If it's to be done at national level, I think that's a slightly different matter. But anyway, I'll pass on now because I think I've filled my 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Sue. That was great. And finally, Roger Harrabin. Roger will be known to many people on this webinar as formerly the BBC's environment analyst. He's now, among other things, doing a fellowship funded by the Foundation for Integrated Transport, looking at how to communicate sustainable transport issues and solutions to the wider world. So, Roger, your reflections on what you've heard. You're on mute. That's better.
I was going to say you gladdened my heart yesterday when you referred in the run up to this, referred to me as a fit fellow. That was a very nice thing to say. So thank you very much. Also, I mean, I'm delighted to take part in this. It's just so interesting. But I am kind of aware that this webinar is populated by nerds, of which I include myself as one. And somehow we have to communicate with the broader general public, and we have to communicate mostly through a media which is possibly going to be hostile. So a number of things about the media. Firstly is the media is inherently conservative. Whenever change is proposed on any issue, then we, the media, find out the people who will most be harmed by that change and amplify their voices as loud as possible. So any change with road pricing, for instance, you might be looking for a carer in North Yorkshire who has to drive 3,000 miles every afternoon and who can't afford it because she's only paid 3p a week. And, we will be finding that person. It'll probably be a telegenic woman, and we will be trumpeting her anxieties as much as we possibly can. So there is a massive obstacle towards change. Another obstacle towards change is the sheer complexity of it all. Now, you would want, in my ideal system, I would want a smart type system in which you are bearing down on people's use of cars which were not electric, which were still polluting. But then you'd also have some fairness element, and that would be very difficult to work out as to where you're going to set your boundaries, or what you would think was reasonable for a person to drive on a weekly basis. And then hopefully you would be able to put forward some sort of commission, or perhaps a citizens' assembly, or perhaps both. But in order to overcome the normal tendencies of the media, one great thing is kind of in your favor at the moment, and that is the lack of tax. And I've been just mentioning from time to time over many years that we are heading towards this crunch on tax. But when the Treasury starts saying it and they start talking about it with political correspondence, then the thing does gain more resonance. And so journalists and newspapers that might typically in the past have been strongly opposed to these sort of changes might be more malleable than they would otherwise have been. But it will be difficult. And you need to form as broad a coalition as possible. I remember reporting on Nottingham. I think hardly anybody in the national media took any notice of Nottingham, but I went up a couple of times, and this kind of feeling in the local media was that the business was completely against it. But when I went around talking to businesses, there were loads of businesses who were in favour of it because they realised that the fewer other people's cars on the road, the more space there was of their own. And the more widely you can get that sort of opinion across there, the more helpful it is. I am heartened by the inventiveness of the people on this call. I must admit, there's some good brains out there. I mean, a couple of little nuggets that I've picked up on our thread. And one is from Brenda saying, "How do you devise a system that deters people from parking their car on the street all year round and using it as a storage site, and then taking a couple of long journeys on holiday?" I mean, that's a genuine and an interesting point of view. And Carolyn warned about, how do you stop people just selling their car or leaving it behind or something and just having more and more deliveries, which again is a kind of reasonable question. And when you've got all these together, you have got a proposal of horrendous complexity. And I suspect it will take a long time to get through unless the Treasury is really, really, really desperate.
Thanks. Really interesting, all of that. Well, look, you've heard from the speakers and you've also heard from Sue and Roger. We've got a number of questions already and comments already submitted. And some of them were about sort of, as it were, factual questions about particularly the Campaign for Better Transport research. Did you divide it up by whether people owned a car, owned a petrol diesel car, owned an electric car, things like that. But one theme that's Elspeth referred to and which several people have raised is what about people in rural areas? Well, actually, Elspeth's research specifically talked about businesses being worried about rural areas and places on the edge of cities. You could argue that's a long-term failure of any kind of land use planning in this country, but we are stuck with some places that are very difficult to get to except by car. Sylvia, I wondered what your research showed about attitudes to do with rural areas, more suburban areas, edge of town industrial estates, and so on. Whether that came up in the research, and whether you'd got some thoughts about that.
Yes, so the research that we did was very in-depth and very sort of extensive. We have vast amounts of sort of different data cuts that we can bring into any discussions when that is happening. So I just looked at the rural versus urban cut. So on the final, whether you support the pay-as-you-drive reform question, there wasn't actually that big a difference. So people categorized in a rural area or in a village, there was 48 and 50% support as opposed to the general 49%. So very similar. There was a higher percentage of support in urban and city centers at 56%. The lowest support was in small towns, and it's understandable because the research we've done previously does class a lot of small towns as transport deserts, but it's still a net positive sort of support for the reform. But yes, as I explained in the slides, how you address the unfairness for people that don't have access to alternatives, that's the main consideration that you need to address. And yes, a smart system that charges you by location and it charges you less when you're driving at in rural areas and other areas that don't have such good connectivity is the best way to do it. But there is a way to do it if you're just charging by mileage. So for example, with the allowance, so with the tax-free mileage allowance that I mentioned. So for example, you can see people with a postcode living in in rural areas, you can see that allowance basically gradually increasing the more rural your postcode being. And no, that is not a perfect way of saying where you're driving, because you could be living in an urban area but driving to see your parents in a village or something. So it's not a perfect way of addressing every journey, but it's a proxy and it addresses that concern about fairness. So there are lots of ways to do it, and just by sort of replacing fuel duty with a smarter system, even if it's just mileage based, it still gives you that way to target people that are unfairly impacted. So that is the factor that Sue talked about, progressiveness. So it's a much more progressive system than the current fuel duty and VAT system, for example.
Elspeth, do you have comments on you raised the issue, or you said the businesses raised the issue of rural areas, of edge of town industrial estates. Did your research or the Napier research come up with any sense of ways forward on that?
I think the main point was just this, the opportunity to have a system which is flexible, which can take account of people's circumstances and where they live. So I think that was sort of the broad consensus, I would just say, that emerged from discussions. We didn't go into in detail about how that might operate.
Are you planning further follow-up work on that as part of the next stage?
So what we're focusing on this year, so last year we talked to the business lobby. This year we are engaging with organisations that represent equalities and access interests. So groups that represent public health, low-income households, disabled people. And we're taking a similar approach to talking to them to understand what their concerns are about demand management and what solutions we can come up with that address those concerns, because we also recognise that those arguments can be a barrier to implementing a scheme like road pricing if we don't consider the equalities issues. So that's the conversation that we're having this year, to try and build an alliance of those interests behind demand management measures.
If I can add something, Stephen, on the fairness point, as I said in the presentation, there's many different ways you can mitigate for specific groups. So you can easily see lower per mile rates for qualifying key workers. There would be consideration to be given about where you draw the line of who is a key worker. But I mean, the concerns of teachers, the concerns of care workers, people that need to drive for their job, including self-employed, sole traders, and so on. It's much easier to offer those mitigations under a road pricing system than it is with the current system. Something else to mention as well, there was a question about EV drivers versus hybrids. If I can just quickly say on that question, there was much higher levels of support for moving to pay-as-you-drive among electric vehicle and hybrid drivers at 63%, then there was among petrol and diesel drivers at 49%. So basically what this is saying to me is that electric vehicle drivers do recognize that it's not likely that electric vehicles would be exempt forever from paying any taxation. So understanding the fairness behind paying taxation at some point.
Thank you. We've had a series of questions about variations on road user charging and, for example, charging by weight as well as distance. on the basis that we've got some cars are getting heavier and so on, whether to how you avoid sort of unintended consequences, like as Roger referred to, somebody had commented about people, more delivery bans because people are doing less mileage. I just wondered whether you had thoughts about that, anybody on this. Sylvia, do you want to comment?
Yes, I can talk about the variables. I mean, as a minimum, pay-as-you-drive needs to be variable by the class and type of vehicle. So cars paying less than vans or trucks would, for example. I mean, that obviously reflects the relative weight of vehicles. Then you have emissions and engine size or engine emissions. That again is a sort of way of reflecting that relative impact and externality on the environment. I mean, I'm not obviously a technical expert, so that would be something by people designing the scheme to consider. But the less complicated it is, obviously, the easier it will be for people to understand. So I wouldn't basically throw every possible variable into the mix. You need to keep it simple for people to understand. Another thing to say is that investing in public transport is absolutely crucial to mitigating people's concerns and addressing that concern about people not having access to alternatives. We need to improve public transport across the country, including rural areas. And that's something that Campaign for Better Transport is advocating for every single day. What we're saying to the Chancellor, for example, in the run-up to the budget, is that he needs to rebalance spending away from road building that only makes congestion and traffic worse, and invest heavily in public transport to prevent massive cuts of bus and train services that there is a danger of us seeing right now. So there needs to be that significant shift in investment priorities, as well as understanding of the need for traffic reduction among politicians, as there is among experts.
Thank you. Roger, did you want to comment on this, on what you've heard from Sylvia and Elspeth in answer to some of the questions?
Yes, I mean, I'd like to throw in with something that's been partially touched on, which is the limiting car use. Now, let me see if I can get it here. Bear with me a second. No, I can't find it. But it was a report I did that you actually, Stephen, commented into when Grant Shapps launched his consultation for his latest transport policy, where he made it very clear that we would have to cut the amount of journeys. It got hardly any pickup. The DFT put it out about 2 or 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. They're obviously fearing a severe backlash because by then most newspaper correspondents are on their way back to their home counties. The government does know. He's just been promoted, or if I assume it's a promotion, to Climate and Energy Security Secretary in the reshuffle today. So there is a voice at the table will be hopefully saying that we need to reduce car usage, and then that raises the issue for me, which I think is another tricky one, but really important, and that's about car ownership, because in order to gain more space on the streets and to pull people onto public transport, we need more car ownership and plenty of access to car clubs and car sharing. But the more people, as we all know, the more people own a car, the more people use that car because they've paid all the overheads. So that's something I would like to see looked at as well. A positive incentive for people to relinquish their cars, possibly by subsidising car clubs instead, would be part of my ideal solution. Another complexity to add to the mix.
Elspeth, I think Transform's quite involved in promoting car clubs and car sharing. If you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So they're definitely represented among our membership as one of the many things that we support in order to have more sustainable transport. So yeah, absolutely, good points.
We've had somebody actually suggest a lift sharing, a sort of public Uber where you're rewarded for giving others a lift.
Yes, why not?
This is goes with that.
The scam potential for that is absolutely immense.
Yes.
If I can add on that,
you just drive your husband around all day.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, just to add to that, I absolutely agree. The big benefit of pay as you drive is that it will be obvious how much you're paying, and then that will automatically incentivize, greater utilization of a car and people sort of sharing where possible. So that is one sort of way to swing people's understanding of the benefits of sharing a car. Obviously, implementing car clubs much more widely would be very important. So I moved to a city out of London a couple of years ago. We still don't own a car, but it's getting increasingly difficult to the point of actually considering buying a car against everything I believe in, because there's no buses to all the places that we want to go. People don't think to offer you a lift. So even if we're going to a kid's birthday party for my kids, the other parents mostly drive, but no one sort of thinks to offer. It's a cultural shift again that we need. But the problem is with car ownership is, as you said, once you buy a car, then you're compelled to drive it, to make the most use of it. And you don't even consider the alternatives. And that is why we need both the improvement in alternatives, but also making ownership and driving slightly more difficult, the two together.
Yes, Stephen, could I push back against the survey results as well? Because, I can see from some points of view, the survey results are very encouraging in the sense that people seem, or the majority of people seem willing to accept some sort of monitoring of their journeys. I suspect if that were put to, if that were put to the general public through the columns of the Telegraph, the Sun, the Mail, the Express, then it would be highly likely to elicit the typical response, which is to spy, remember, with tachographs with lorries to try to make lorries safer and stop drivers working for 58 hours a day. They were asked to install tachographs, instantly became known as the spy in the cab, the hated spy in the cab. You wait for the word hated, okay, as a sort of distinguishing descriptive, and then you're onto a battle. And, there are very strong libertarian forces in this country at the moment. They've had a bit of a setback, but, I don't think they're going away, and they have control of several newspapers. So I would think the personal liberty aspect of knowing where having somebody monitor where you're going. I mean, imagine, for instance, let's suppose my wife wanted to go and see her lover, for instance. I mean, I could, she doesn't have a lover, actually, as far as I know, but I could tot up the journey from when it last was and ask her why she'd driven 23 miles on Friday night when the cinema was only a mile and a half away. So, one can imagine all sorts of problems stemming from that.
You can. However, I was going to ask actually everybody this. It feels to me that the debate, when road pricing was last seriously talked about in 2007-8, and there was a petition of several million people signed against it. At that time, there was rather less in the terms of social media. People give exactly, somebody's just commented, my friends already track each other like that on Strava. I mean, that's somebody's just commented on that. I just wondered whether you felt that the fact that we just hand over enormous amounts of data willy-nilly through mobile phones, you can already track by grabbing your wife's phone whether she's got a lover. You can see it. I just wonder whether, and there's a question for both Sylvia and Elspeth really, whether those kinds of concerns have gone away. There was a sense from Sylvia's survey that whereas people hate cameras, somebody in the chat's commented as sort of, psychologically spy outside, etc. People seemed much more relaxed about in-car tracking. And I just wonder whether all of that's changed a bit. Elspeth, I don't know whether businesses felt that too. Sylvia, do you want to comment first?
Yes, in short, it's exactly, as you say, Stephen. So there is a great acceptance that, we are being tracked anyway. So there was a question specifically on that, and many people felt exactly that way. And as the person that commented in the chat said, that is exactly the problem with cameras, that people see them as, being watched and Big Brother, and, they're there, that is in plain sight, that they associate them with penalty tickets when they're speeding. So it's something inherently bad. Whereas even if it's a plug-in in-vehicle device, it's sort of out of sight, out of mind. People don't really consider it as obtrusive as a camera. And that's even more the case with telematics, which are already built into the all new cars that are coming on the market, and obviously cars that have been sold over the last few years. So it's something that people already accept and use in a variety of ways, which is I think that's partly behind what's shifted perception. But the other thing is that it's important to have a solution to all people's concerns, and that is what our research focused on. So the ability to be able to opt out of being tracked and being charged by a smart system and being charged by just mileage or just even an annual tax. There are ways for people to address those concerns, that people that are really worried about privacy. So having that solution available in advance to address people's concerns, I think, will be really important.
Elspeth, do you have comments on that?
Yeah, just to echo that, I think that things have moved on, and the public in general are possibly more accepting of tracking or the telematics scheme than they have been in the past. It wasn't an issue which was raised in our discussions with business groups as a concern.
Sue, do you have views on that side of the argument? Has privacy issues come up in any of the work you've done?
No, but I have a view on the complexity of the proposed scheme, and I do think there is considerable advantages to having a more like a cheap and cheerful scheme that doesn't necessarily involve endless technology, and even if it's low charging rates, lower than you would think would be the right ones, if it can get a scheme in, then it's got great advantage, and everybody, as everybody knows, if you can get a scheme in, you can change the rates later on. So I think simplicity is, and Sylvia said this, I think simplicity is really important, and obviously there's a clash there between catering for different groups and catering for different people, but still simplicity is important.
Yeah, Sylvia, did you want to comment on that? Because that did come up in your work.
On the simplicity, yes, of course, that is the inherent conflict between being fair and also simple for the sake of explaining it to people and increasing acceptance. I think that there is a way to design a system that is simple at the front end and sort of having the complex calculations on the back end, as long as you're presenting to people a charging structure that's easy to understand. But I think it is important to then provide these lower rates or exemptions or allowances for people that will be unfairly affected. So we're seeing that in the current discussion with the ULEZ, and that's something I wanted to come to, the difference between national and local schemes.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that, and
yes,
and in fact everybody about the national versus local.
But in terms of the debate for ULEZ and other local schemes, you're hearing, because it's a blunt set daily charge based on a cordon, you don't have a way of sort of reflecting a shorter journey or a person who really needs to drive for their job. But you could provide an exemption, or you could provide a grace period for people like care workers that need to drive for their job. And I think that is really important in order to address those concerns. Having the data to show what proportion of people don't have compliant cars, for example, what proportion of those on low income. So being able to offer that mitigation, I think, is important. Between national and local schemes, I think it's important to distinguish that they're different things for different purposes. So a national scheme is obviously for the purpose of taxation. It goes to central government to use as general taxation to fund public services. Although there can be a revenue share agreement with local authorities, our survey showed that it's very important that some of that revenue is hypothecated for roads improvements and for public transport investment, whereas local schemes are to mitigate for the negative impacts of congestion and pollution on local roads, and these are implemented entirely by local government. The proceeds go to local government. They must be spent entirely on transport. So it's important not to mix the two together, but it is possible to create a system. So under the smart scheme that basically reflects for location, you can have the base rate of charges for taxation and going to central government, and the local top up for the local impacts. And I think that is what people are most drawn to, having a simple system. So one system that charges you for travel rather than separate national schemes and local schemes. So when we ask people about their preference, should it be just national scheme with top-ups or separate national and local schemes, 42% said they prefer the former and 24% the latter. So clearly the simplicity there is important. So there is a way to make it work. I think that is the best way to ensure that local impacts are considered, because obviously every local authority to act on its own impetus to implement a local scheme is quite difficult. So having one sort of process of reform to reflect for those two things is obviously the ideal scenario.
Thank you. Sue, do you have a reflection on this, having implemented or tried to implement local schemes?
And implemented one.
Implemented one and tried to implement some others. Yeah.
Yeah. I agree with Sylvia. I think I agree with Sylvia that a national scheme is very much preferred. And I suspect that my requirement for progressiveness can actually only be done with a national scheme, because I don't think that the data on people's incomes and the data that you would need to make it progressive would be available at a local level. So I think it would have to be at a national level. And I think it would have to make use of HMRC, which is a progressive tax, our income tax system. So I would fully support a national scheme, but with local areas able to do extras if they wanted to. So London, for example, would always want to do a congestion charging scheme, I suspect. And other cities might want to be like Nottingham and do a workplace parking levy or do congestion charging, but it should be based on a national scheme. I would argue.
This is a technical question from Leah Murray. Without in-car tracking, is there a model for per mile charging that allows for differentiation by regional access to alternatives? I think that's one for Sylvia.
Yeah, good question. I'm not sure. So if you're using, so yes, telematic is tracking again. So I think the short answer is no, because if you have a system entirely based on mileage where you're charged at your MOT, although you might be paying a sort of slightly lower rate if you're driving a low emission car, then there is no way to reflect for location. So the only way to do that is to supplement that middle option of national scheme with local schemes, and that is when local schemes still have obviously value, and then the revenue from the scheme goes directly to the city or local authority. So this version has its benefits, but for then the disbenefit is that people would be charged by different sort of apps and different systems if they go to different cities. So yes, it's not the ideal version, I would say.
One way of dealing with it, which again is not foolproof, of partially dealing with this issue of car ownership and car location, would be to keep the VED system, call it road tax or call it something else, and have a lower road tax in rural areas where it was accepted that there wasn't a good alternative, and a higher road tax in urban areas where people would be more willing to think that public transport or walking and cycling were options. I mean, it has its own problems, but it's a thought, and it's a very obvious way of addressing the issue.
Yes, or higher tax-free allowances, as I said earlier. but it's not, so it doesn't address all the negative, all the deficiencies of not a smart system.
Thank you. The one final question, because we'll need to leave this soon. One question we're thinking about this generally is, how do we convince politicians that road pricing will benefit more people than it will penalise? Or, how do we get this over the line politically? Sylvia came up with one answer, which was a cross-party long-term commission. Roger has raised questions of how the media will treat this by finding the worst possible case. Somebody's commented, Leah's commented, that too large a share of the proliferation of drivers' concerns about measures to curb driving are based on imaginary grievances and beliefs about schemes that have no evidential basis, which I think is fair. If you look at some of the stuff that's being spread around, for example, Oxford, about the World Economic Forum trapping people in their homes as part of 15-minute neighbourhoods, which I think is what some of the objectors to the scheme there are saying. But I just wondered how people felt from here on. We persuade devolved government, in the case of Scotland, national government, to move in the direction of road charging and so on. Sylvia, do you want to start on that?
I think that the best way to make politicians more sort of see the benefits of it is by communicating research like ours. So the more politicians are aware that the public are on board and that the public can benefit from those changes, that is when that is what gives politicians the ability to then act. Communicating that the vast majority of people would benefit from simpler, more transparent, fairer tax system. I think that is key to this. So recognizing that high polluters or high users might sort of end up paying slightly more than they do now, but that the vast majority of people would benefit. So depending on how you design a system, it is possible that the majority of people will actually pay less than they currently do, especially if you take fuel duty out of the price of fuel. Then you're losing the VAT that is then charged on fuel duty within the price of fuel as well. So you can have a very sort of simple support with cost of living message. So it can tick lots of boxes. So leveling up, obviously net zero, as well as cost of living and economic prosperity. So that is the way to appeal to a broad range of sort of politicians. But yes, I think keeping the cross-party agreements, it's very important for to ensure that no party basically opposes the need to reform, because then whoever is in government next will have the problem of the declining tax revenue. So making sure that people's voices are reflected and you have that broad engagement as possible in the development of a new system, so that different groups of people's concerns are then addressed at that stage, rather than when it comes to just formal consultation at the end.
Elspeth, how have you found, how is this, the work you've done going down with politicians in Scotland? You had a picture of the Transport Minister launching a report, but she's only one minister. I just wondered whether you felt that the kinds of comments that your work was making, whether that was going to be acceptable in Scotland.
I think the conversation is happening, and the benefit to the work that we and others are doing is that load pricing kind of becomes inevitable, because, and if there was a change in government, and if it has that momentum behind it, it wouldn't matter so much. I think in terms of the language the business community uses, it's important to talk about things like congestion. So that's a really strong argument. So it's not just about environmental benefits, for example. It's also, nobody likes traffic jams, nobody likes congestion, and this is a way to tackle it. So I think that's a really important argument. Yeah. I think it's essential to show the benefits. So coming back again to investment in public transport, so people can see that road pricing or other similar measures, if the income is being used to invest it in public transport, then that's a really crucial strong argument, which is maybe where your local schemes come in as part of an overall national system, and also to show that it can be fairer. So the current system itself does have a lot of inequalities and offence attached to it. I think the Scottish Government in particular is very concerned about the fairness arguments, and that's something which they are looking into because they recognise that that could be a big barrier. So that's an important thing to tackle as well. But I think there's a lot of nervousness around it at the moment because the cost of living, that, as has always been mentioned, a massive reluctance to introduce, or a change in costs, or the change in tax upon people who might already be struggling. So it is a difficult time, but perhaps if we lay the groundwork now, then in 1 or 2 years, then that will pay off when it does become more politically acceptable.
Thank you. Sue, having just been through an experience of not getting a scheme through where politicians kind of found it too difficult, do you have reflections on how you get persuade politicians to move in this direction?
In order to do a local scheme, you have to be very brave, and you need to have a local political setup that is well established and fairly confident of winning the next election or the next election after that, because it does stir up a lot of issues, and reasonably local politicians get worried about their votes, and national politicians do as well. So that's a problem with any change of anything. I think you also have to be a bit careful about making sure that you get your allies on side, and allies are not always the people who you think they might be. So sometimes people who you would think would be aware of, say, air quality and carbon arguments are very, very much attached to their cars and are not actually the allies that you would think that they might be. But I mean, some allies are definitely those people who don't use cars and who use public transport or walking and cycling. And I think that there's much more effort has to be made to get those people actually talking about it and actually thinking about what the benefits might be in terms of lower traffic areas, easier to walk and cycle, safer, less pollution. I mean, those very day-to-day things, you can talk to your neighbour easier. Those sorts of things hardly come up in the general conversations about charging. And I think something has got to support that sizable minority of people who stand to benefit not only by improving public transport, but also by improving their local areas.
Roger, do you have some sense on how we get the politicians, particularly given the comments you've made about media and the way the media?
I think it's very difficult. I mean, one thing just to pick up on is fuel duty. You know, we are facing a climate emergency. I mean, that's acknowledged by the government. It's not a good time to make driving petrol or diesel cars cheaper. So although it might be a good thing to do from the point of view of getting the scheme through, in policy terms and carbon dioxide terms, probably is not a brilliant idea. In terms of getting politicians to see the research and digest it, yes, fantastic and really, really useful. But the average MP and the average minister sees the newspaper cuttings or website cuttings on their desk every morning and takes their cue from, you know, what's coming into their inbox rather than necessarily sitting down and reading a heavily nuanced report like this one. So the media are a crucial part of the solution here. And well, hopefully I'll be doing a bit more thinking about how to engage them over the next following months. But then the third final thought really is that in terms of the parties that would be most likely to be agreeable to this, my guess is that the Lib Dems and Labour would be least resistant to it, and that there would be more things in it that would typically annoy or irritate or outrage conservative leaning people, and particularly those newspapers where there's a small cadre of columnists who take really quite strong views on individual liberty. So in an ideal world, you'd have them on board and the policy would be brought into place with no opposition from Labour and the Lib Dems. But of course, it doesn't look as though those people will be very influential in government for very much longer. So if Labour win the election, then they will probably face strong opposition from MPs on the Conservative side who see it as a good way of chipping away at a new government. Too soon to tell, but just a few warnings from me.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Well, we're coming up to the end of this. Can I ask people for final comments? Sylvia, do you want to say your reflections and where you go next, perhaps, with this?
Yes, definitely. So I agree that we need to demonstrate that support to politicians, to media, to the public as well. So we are building a wide coalition of organizations who support the case for reform. So to bring people on board and to demonstrate the range of stakeholders who are supportive of this and that groundswell. The other side of the coin is to galvanize support from people on the ground, and this is where campaigning organizations like us and others come in to energize people to write positively to the MP and to the media. To balance out any the other side of people who might be still feeling negative about this. So and that's why I think it's important to have a as balanced a discussion as possible to bring out all voices to the fore. Basically, I think that's where we'll be concentrating next.
Thanks, Elspeth.
Yeah, so in Scotland, we are continuing to build a broader alliance in support of change. Last year, we engaged the business community, and through doing so, helped to sort of pick up some of the arguments against measures like road pricing that might come from the Conservative or the more right-wing press, by showing that the business community is behind some of these ideas. This year, we're focusing more on the equality issues, which is helping to address some of the arguments or concerns that might come more from the left, so from Labour Party, for example. So I think the key is to engage people, also people outside the sustainable and active travel world, because we are broadly in agreement with each other. So it's about challenging people that hold different opinions, bring them into the conversation and show that actually road pricing is not such a scary topic after all, that there is a broad consensus that change needs to happen. Again, that taxation argument is really powerful and I think well understood. So to get people behind it from the broadest spectrum of interests and political parties as possible.
Thank you. Sue, do you have some reflections on what you've heard?
I think I've said this before, so just very quickly, I actually saw from the charity Possible the other day some drawings of some roads in Bristol that could be improved with less traffic on them. Just more of that, more where you can actually see in a picture how your neighbourhood can be improved. I think that would be hugely helpful.
Thank you. And Roger?
Yeah, I mean, just the final thought. I'm aware that I'm being a bit of a negative voice, and I really want to applaud this seminar because I think it's been terrific, and I do strongly support the need for reform. But I just want to kind of sound a warning that when politicians and media people profess that they agree there needs to be reform, and they look at your research showing that reform is welcomed, that doesn't mean the specific items on the list of things that you want to reform will be agreed by the public. It means they vaguely know that something has to change. But when it comes down to how it affects me or my neighbour or the carer in North Yorkshire, then that's the position, that's the place where opposition could get entrenched. So that's just worth thinking about that before. Don't get overconfident.
Thanks very much, and thanks to everybody for taking part, to Sylvia, Elspeth, Sue and Roger. The foundation will carry on funding work in this area. We'll also be doing more in the area of social equity, on transport as a basic right, public transport as a basic right, which was a big theme of our founder. And we're already funding, voices for change in places like Oxford and Cambridge and Wales, where there's a lot of radical proposals on the table, not all, as I say, with entire local support. So we will continue to play our part in making and helping people make the case for reducing traffic and for road pricing, forms of road pricing as part of that. So thank you everybody for taking part. Thank you also to Brogan Macpherson for the background work on this, for making this happen, and to fellow trustees, particularly Lisa Hopkinson and the Executive Secretary of the Foundation, Madeline Roberts, for helping put this on. So thank you very much, and we'll keep in touch. Thank you.